Hi, this is Matt with Fruition Partners. We're going to get our webinar started here in just a few minutes. We've got over 80 people registered, and so far about 15 have joined us. And I certainly don't expect all 80 to show up, but I do want to wait maybe 2 or 3 more minutes to give some other people a chance to join. So we'll be getting started in, let's say, about 3 minutes, and that should be about 12:35, 36 Eastern Time. If you have any trouble hearing me, go ahead and at any point during the presentation, go ahead and post a question, and we'll make sure that we're getting that addressed. Okay, so we'll get ready in just about a minute here, but I brought up my screen, and I just want to make sure that everyone is seeing that screen okay. So if there's any problems with that, go ahead and send a message our way and let us know. But we might as well get started at this point. As I mentioned earlier, my name is Matt Hawk. I'm a technical consultant with Fruition Partners. It's a pleasure to be doing this webinar with all of you today. I've done a couple of webinars in the past, and some of them have been posted on .com. Eventually, we have these webinars archived so that we can go back to them in the future in case you missed anything here now. Let's see, we got one message from somebody who's not able to see my screen. Would anyone else be able to post a question to confirm you can see it or otherwise? Okay, great. All right, it looks like we've got people looking at our screen, so we're ready to get started. So just to let you know about Fruition Partners, for those of you who have been on our webinars, you've heard this a couple of times, so bear with me for just a few minutes. But the history of Fruition Partners is that we are an IT service management consulting and education company. We have clients across the country, and we have a few international clients as well. We were founded in 2003. We have clients in a range of industries. One that's not on the list is we have a couple of clients in the social media space. We've really been experiencing some terrific growth. We have 40 consultants at this point, and really that growth is due in no small part to the strong partnership that we have with ServiceNow, providing implementation services for many of their clients. All of our professionals are certified ITIL professionals. We have people with foundations level certification like myself, but then we also do have consultants who are involved in the more in the higher level service management consulting space, we have consultants that go all the way up to the service manager. And I think actually we have someone here who's a ITIL master as well, and he's involved in some of our training. And the last bullet point is that we try as a company to really allow our practical field experience that we have with our clients, provide feedback over to our education side and make the ITIL training experience more meaningful. And vice versa, of course. We expect that theoretical education to really inform our engagements with our ServiceNow and other clients. So from a service offering standpoint, we offer services really in 3 different categories. We have the education services that I had mentioned. That's really geared towards both ServiceNow education as well as ITIL education. And we offer ServiceNow administration training, service catalog workshop, and then on the ITIL side, we offer classes in Foundation and bridging V2 and V3. And then something else new that we've started doing that kind of loosely is under education. It's a health check service where we really try to help you assess your overall service management processes, and it can also be geared towards more of a technical assessment of your ServiceNow instances, where we can point out where the instance that you're using may be really substantially deviating from some of the best practices that we've seen. Within administration, we have a product or a service that's called virtual administration, and this is really a way for your staff of ServiceNow administrators to be augmented by ServiceNow administrators at Fruition Partners. So you can buy a block of hours on a monthly basis where our administrators, some of whom are involved in some of our most advanced implementations, those administrators are basically at your disposal for either troubleshooting problems or building out new functionality, however you'd like to use them. And then in customization, we do a lot of work in terms of building out entirely new modules and new functionality for our customers. We've built customizations that are on top of sort of the core applications like incident, change, CMDB, but we've also built custom applications from the ground up, totally outside of those applications, just using the ServiceNow platform as a really terrific place to start developing a custom solution. And one of the offerings that we have sort of within customization is that we're now beginning, it's not mentioned right on this slide, but we're now beginning to offer something called a solution offering. And the solution offering is really, these are modules of ServiceNow customized software that we have seen several of our clients needing the same solution. We've developed that solution, we've provided it to clients in the past, and now we're starting to see clients come back to us time and again with the same needs. So we're able to take some of those solution offerings and package them, and rather than going through a more typical consulting engagement, we can turn around delivery of these solutions on a much quicker basis. Two that we have right now that come to mind are a time tracking solution, as well as the time tracking solution is, to be clear, is really to enhance ServiceNow so that your entire IT staff, both developers and operations folks, can log all of their hours, all 40 of their weekly hours in ServiceNow through a very easy-to-use interface. And then we also have an LDAP enhancement, which enhances some of the on-demand functionality within LDAP for customers who have, very, very large LDAP servers. We have one customer who has over 2 million accounts within their LDAP server, which I like to point out to them is 1% of the adult U.S. population. And they had a need to basically pull over users from their LDAP server on an on-demand fashion, which, as you can imagine, when you're trying to identify a caller on an incident, there's some interesting challenges that come up in that situation. So That's another solution offering where if your organization has the same kind of challenge, we can be available to help deploy a solution for that particular problem. The next slide is quite a lot to digest. It's just some quotes that we've received from our customers. My favorite is the one right in the middle because it's the shortest and it kind of summarizes everything else, which is that giving excellent customer references. So we're very proud of our ability to take our existing customer base and receive recommendations from them for new services. And so really what it all adds up to is an approach where we're trying to become the ITSM one-stop shop. And that really ties together the three areas: education, consulting, and ServiceNow geared development and customization, so that we can provide both the business-focused process consulting, but also the very technical high level of expertise that's required in successfully deploying ServiceNow, but really extending its usage and expanding how you use it within your organization over time. So that's sort of a summary of Fruition Partners, and like I said, for those of you who have been in these webinars before, thank you for your patience and listening to that piece about Fruition Partners. So today we're going to be talking about LDAP, and certainly LDAP can be sort of a basic piece of ServiceNow, but we've been involved in projects where suddenly LDAP becomes a source of challenge, and so we've seen kind of a range from very straightforward LDAP implementations to the kind of implementation I just mentioned where there's an issue with just the sheer quantity of users and security concerns about who's being mirrored within ServiceNow, when, and so on. So today in the webinar agenda, what I thought I'd go through is an overview of LDAP itself and some basics of configuring it within ServiceNow. Then I'll talk a little bit about two sort of problem areas that I think some of our clients wind up needing to come up with a solution for. So I can talk about these. It's basically how do you handle account deactivations, people who leave your organization, and how do you have those deactivations reflected within ServiceNow. And then the last one is managing accounts across multiple instances. A lot of customers who use LDAP, especially customers who have been live for a while, those customers will run into issues if they continue to use LDAP in all of their instances, including dev, QA, or test, as well as production. So I want to point out some issues to be on the lookout for if you do have multiple instances, and how LDAP should ideally fit into a multi-instance scenario. So as far as sort of an overview of LDAP, I thought it would be helpful to kind of reiterate some of the key points that come from the ServiceNow wiki and what they say about LDAP integration. And it's important to note that LDAP really serves two different purposes. They're certainly related, but they really are separate. And one purpose is that LDAP is used to manage ServiceNow user and group records within ServiceNow. So what this is that basically any user that wants to be able to use ServiceNow needs to have a record in the user table, in the ServiceNow user table. So LDAP integration can manage the creation, the updating, and the deactivating, although not deleting, of those user records. And additionally, LDAP can manage records within the group table. So really, the end goal of all of this integration is you need to have user records in the user table. In the case of that large client I mentioned earlier, they still had that requirement. They still eventually needed to get to the point where users were listed in the user table. They just wanted to bring them over on an as-needed basis. So there's really no way of getting around needing to have that user record or that group record. The second purpose that LDAP serves is it's really serving as a way to authenticate your sessions. So when somebody logs in, LDAP can validate the username and password they supply. In this way, ServiceNow user records don't need to contain passwords. So I guess a sort of a high-level point to make about this, because I saw it mentioned on the wiki, I thought I would repeat it, which is that ServiceNow, its integration with LDAP is on a read-only basis. So ServiceNow does not need any permissions to write or alter any of your records. You merely need to give it an account to log into your LDAP server that's capable of reading records. And that account is used both for the management and population of your user and group records in ServiceNow, and then that account is also used when it comes time to actually authenticate somebody's login. So just as in terms of terminology, what I've seen come up with talking to our clients, and this is just sort of casual terminology, but it might help to think about it. At the bottom in italics, I mentioned that a user record in ServiceNow that contains both a username and password, a lot of people will call that a local account, and I guess that's a concept that probably spans a lot of different applications besides ServiceNow. But the difference there is a more typical user record is going to contain just the username and rely on something like LDAP for authentication, and we usually just refer to those as accounts generally, and it's kind of assumed that those are using an external authentication source. Most typically, the local accounts are administrators, the actual 2 or 3 administrators that you have for ServiceNow. Most people don't bother putting those in their LDAP server, so they just configure those as ServiceNow local accounts. Okay, so configuration basics. I thought maybe I would look at record management first. That's the sort of the first piece, is how do we go about getting user records into ServiceNow. And really, there's a very basic setup that a lot of people use by default, and that's just using standard ServiceNow integration modules. So it's kind of neat that when you look at the LDAP integration application within ServiceNow, all of the different pieces of it that you're looking at, they really are just pieces that are built out of standard ServiceNow integration tools like import set tables, transform maps, data sources, and scheduled jobs. So really, it's very similar, although certainly it has its differences. It's very similar to just synchronizing records from a database or some other batch job that you might have running on ServiceNow. So in addition to those basic integration modules, there's 2 additional features that are provided in ServiceNow. One is the LDAP listener, and the other is LDAP on-demand login. The LDAP listener, the purpose of that is to allow changes in your LDAP server to be pushed, quote unquote, to be pushed to the ServiceNow instance. So if, for example, you have a user that has their last name changed. If they have their last name changed at noon and they'd like that name to be reflected in their instance as quickly as possible, then the LDAP listener is a mechanism by which the update to that user record within LDAP can be pushed immediately to ServiceNow, rather than waiting for a scheduled job such as what's listed at the top of the slide, rather than waiting for maybe midnight that night for that change to get pulled over. The second feature is LDAP on-demand login, which is kind of similar to listener, but it's a little bit different. The purpose of this is to allow new users that have not yet been synced, from I'm sorry, somebody just passed me a question that was raised. Give me 1 second to make sure we don't have any technical issues here. Okay, it looks like these are just some suggested questions for later. Sorry about that. So LDAP on-demand login. So this is for people who are new in the LDAP server. They haven't been brought over at midnight that night. This provides a way for them to actually log in. And what ServiceNow does is, as soon as the person tries to log in, it looks for that user in the user table. If they don't find it, it then goes to LDAP next and tries to pull over the user record on an as-needed basis at that point in time. So that's ServiceNow functionality that they provide with LDAP integration. So if we take a look at if we take a look at the actual setup of these records, I'm using our own internal sandbox here at Fruition Partners. And what I thought I'd do is just show you how easily you can create a login for. Let me just pull up this. I've got what I've got is a locally running LDAP server here that I thought I would use just real quickly for demonstration purposes. So let me just pull up my, here we go. So I'm going to delete the server and I'll recreate it so I can show you the steps that are involved. So basically, when you're ready to integrate with your LDAP server, on the left-hand side of ServiceNow, if you type in LDAP, it'll pull up all of the modules that you'll need to use in the integration. You can click Create New Server. And in this case, I'm using Open LDAP. I don't have an Active Directory server running, so I'm going to choose Other. And of course, the one thing I didn't manage to write down is what's my IP. So I'm going to go to what'smyipaddress.org. I'll paste that in there. I'll paste that in the host name. And then you need to, once you supply the address of the LDAP server, you need to supply a username and password. Now, let me see at what point in the slide I talk about security, because I know that security is probably a big concern. So that's coming up under security. Back to that. So to log into this server, I set up an account for myself on the LDAP server. I'm going to provide that username. The password, I believe, is ServiceNow. And the starting search directory, I'm going to start at the top. This is just a dummy LDAP server, but at the top of it we have the base level directory. So let's see if I save that. That was a right-click save that I just did in case the screen refreshed and catch it. Okay, and then you can do a couple of things with just the server record to make sure that the server record itself is working the way that you want. And you can either test the connection. And you know what? I apologize. I didn't realize when I had set this up at my cubicle a minute in here. I really apologize for this. Give me 2 or 3 minutes here, and I'll get this set up again and going for us. So I'm just trying to get this little virtual machine appliance running again. I had the LDAP server running here just a minute ago. It should have occurred to me when I moved to a different office so you all could hear me okay. It screwed up the IP addresses, so I apologize for that. Okay, so let me see if I can pull up this administration center again. All right. So for those of you who are curious, I'm just running this virtual appliance which has Open LDAP installed as well as this PHP LDAP admin. All right, so let's see if I can test this connection again. Oh, shoot. Let me try one more thing, and then if I can't get this going after a minute, I will move on without demonstrating the creation of these records. I apologize. Hold on one second. Okay, thankfully, I've got it working. I guess what's my IP address reported the wrong IP address at first. I have no idea why it would do that. So I've got my IP address, and I guess this is kind of a setup that might mirror something you would have to do in your production environment, which is on our own firewall on our LAN. I needed to set up some port forwarding to forward to the internal address that we have here. So when we get into security, we'll talk about the different forms of architecture that you can set up for your LDAP server. But in this case, I'm just forwarding port 389, which is the basic LDAP port, so that service now can talk to that LDAP server that I have running. So what I had mentioned earlier, so within an LDAP server record, you can do testing of the connection and you can do browsing as well. And browsing is a really important feature. If you click that browse link, it's a really important feature to make sure that you're seeing within your server, you're seeing the objects that you expect to see. So we see right now I've got a user called default user in the users OU, and then within something I set up called users inactive, we have somebody else called Bob Smith. So just real quick, if I create somebody new over here, I want to do this anyway because when I run the import, I want to be sure to pick up somebody besides just the default user. So if I create a user account, actually that's going to be the last name. So we've got S. Johnson. I'm going to make that her password as well. I'll just do that. Whoa. So let's make sure, yep, so there's Sally. So now that she's in the LDAP server, I should be able to go back to the server record here and click Browse and see her listed there as well as default user. Yep, there she is. Okay, so that's the first layer. You first need the server record, which I just created and tested. Then within the server record, down at the bottom, you have OU definitions, and these are sort of the next layer down, which help you identify key OUs within your LDAP hierarchy. And in this case, I'm going to just set up one of them. So I'm going to get rid of groups and focus just on setting up this user's OU. Now you can name the OU anything you want, but it should be sort of descriptive of what it is I'm trying to pull in. So in this case, I'm going to be pulling in users, and within my particular instance, what I'm actually going to be looking within is I'm going to be looking within OU equals users. So if we look at my hierarchy, we know that the server record I set up gets me this far, which is O equals directory. Now I need to dive within that and go to OU equals users. So I'll do that. Usually you don't change the query field CN. That's a unique identifier for the user record. And I think this is all that I need to do to this record. And OU records work the same way as the server record. I can browse them. And when I do that browsing, we see that now it's dumping me directly within that users piece of the tree. So I don't have to first go into users and then user groups. So now basically I have the server record, I have the OU record attached to it, and now what I'm ready to do is attach a data source record to it. And by default, ServiceNow will already have a data source record attached to it. And the data source is really what bridges the gap between those standard integration modules I mentioned earlier, like load and transform and scheduled job and import sets. It's what bridges that with the LDAP records that I just configured. So in this case, what I'm going to do is, it's already given me a default data source record. I don't need to change anything on this record, although if I wanted to, what I could do is I could do a test load of 20 records. And what this will do is it'll create an import set table if it doesn't already exist, and it'll just do a straight dump of the records from LDAP into that table. So if I take a look at the data that it loaded, then we can see I'm now looking at our import set table, which of course, if I go to the import and transform module, I can also get to the table through that. On the left-hand side, we see underneath system import sets, we see this table listed right here. So it's loaded some of this sample data. Some of that data was already in there because I did a load earlier. So let me go back to the data source record, and then I'll show you the transform map. So LDAP data sources, and now I'm going to come into, I think I'm going to, wait, let me make sure I get this right. I'll come to it through the server record instead. Okay. Wait, I don't know if our ISP just changed our IP address today or what, but that was strange. Usually our IP address does not change. Okay, so we have user records here, the user data source. Let me go into that real quick. I just did a test load of 20 records. Now the transform map, that's of course what's going to actually take values from that import set table and put it into the user table. And I'll just do this real quick because I know we've got to get onto these other topics. And my technical difficulties kind of slowed me down there. So we've already got some good field maps that are established here. It looks to me like this is probably all we need to use. You may have to adjust the field maps. In my case, I had to change, I think by default it sets it up with SAM account name as the unique identifier. And of course that's Active Directory. In this case I wanted to use UID. And other than that, you can really, you can do the field mappings that are appropriate for your instance. So now that I have that transform map in place, what I can do is actually go into the data source, into the transform, and now I'll just go ahead and run the transform. And that's successful. So now if we go to our users table, and this is our, like I said, this is our Fruition sandbox. So we have a lot of our employees are listed in here. I know that we have, we should have Bob Smith in here, and that was brought over from LDAP. I think it was brought over just now, but we'll double check this when I start talking about the LDAP multi-user, or I'm sorry, LDAP deactivations. So let's go back real quick to the presentation. So I showed you how to set up the server record, the OU records, and then once you have those in place, you're ready to set up a standard import set, a transform map. I showed you data source. The data source record is what points to the server and OU records. I didn't show you scheduled job, but of course you can schedule your LDAP loads to occur on a recurring basis. So within the LDAP integration module, you can come down here to schedule loads and identify, create a new load. For example, this load here, I could either run it now, or I could set up a schedule over on the right here on how often I want that load to run. So that's what's actually going to create your records within ServiceNow. And most people run that once a night. Now, from an authentication standpoint, remember I said earlier it's LDAP is doing record management and authentication. So authentication, usually you don't have to do anything, but the important point to make here is that if you're looking into a single sign-on scenario, then maybe single sign-on will take the place of ServiceNow authenticating directly with LDAP. But however, it cannot take the place of still needing LDAP to furnish those user records. So sometimes when we start getting into single sign-on types of configurations with our clients, it can start to get confusing. What is single sign-on doing? And it's important to make the point that single sign-on is really taking care of the authentication piece of this integration, but that you still need LDAP to actually somehow provide those actual user records within ServiceNow. And then the last thing on configuration is from a security standpoint. I've just reproduced the answer that they provide in the wiki from a security standpoint. Certainly LDAP can be configured in a secure fashion. There's several options for LDAP integration generally, and some of them are secure. So one option is to expose LDAP through a firewall using standard LDAP. That's basically what I've done for the demonstration that we're looking at right now. But of course, most of our clients are going to be using the second or third option, which is to expose LDAP through the firewall, but use it with a secure certificate so that you can use secure LDAP, LDAP-S. And then we also have some customers that prefer to establish a secure VPN tunnel between ServiceNow's data center and your own data center, and then LDAP communication takes place over that tunnel. And I believe this is sold as an add-on, so it's not included necessarily with every single ServiceNow implementation. Okay, so one of the issues that I've run into with a lot of clients is that we need to give some attention to how we want to handle account deactivations. So the important point here is that the first thing you need to realize is that this is not necessarily a crisis situation if you don't address it right away. As long as LDAP does not authenticate a user, so as long as somebody has been deactivated in LDAP, and LDAP is going to reject the authentication of that user, they're not going to be able to log into ServiceNow. However, what this addresses is that you still probably want your user records in ServiceNow to be updated and be marked inactive so that they're removed from lists throughout ServiceNow. So, what I'm talking about is, if you're on an incident, for example, and you want to assign a user, a caller to that incident, when you actually go into this list of users, over time, you're going to want to start pulling people who have left the company. You're going to want to start pulling them off of that list. So you are going to want some kind of LDAP integration to address the deactivation of your users, and that's something that fairly often is overlooked. An important point to make here too, kind of the second paragraph there, is to never delete user accounts in ServiceNow. I mean, it's not like never, never, ever, ever, never, but it's it's something where you usually want to leave your user accounts in there so that the references on all of your incidents and change tickets and so on, those references still point to informative records about who the user is, rather than just, I don't know if you've ever seen in ServiceNow when you delete a record and there's other records that reference it, then what you get is these funny-looking sysids that don't really mean anything, and it makes it look like ServiceNow is completely broken. And really all it is that you've removed that underlying referenced record. So different organizations I've seen, they kind of do deactivations in LDAP in different ways. Some of them will use an attribute on the LDAP record itself, and then others will do some combination of that along with moving users to a separate OU. So in my little demo instance, I had an example of users that become inactive, and I'm moving this guy, Bob Smith, to a different OU called users inactive. And so if you want to pick those up, what you could do is you could create, we've already got the data source. Well, actually, I think we would need a new data source record. Let me go to the server record here. So what you need to do to pick up your deactivations in this situation, I've already got an OU defined for users. I need to create a second OU because now I'm identifying a second branch in the tree that I want to look within. Oops. Actually, you know what would be easier in this situation? Just open up the one that's already there. They give you one by default. If you recall, I had to tweak it a little bit to use my distinguished name. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to actually rename this one. And remember, from my PHP admin, it said it was users inactive. And then I'll do an insert and stay. So insert and stay basically created a new OU definition record. And let me browse this just to make sure that now I'm looking in. Yep, there we go. So Bob, you might recall, is my inactive user. So now when I look at the server, I've got users and I've got users inactive. Now that alone isn't really going to do anything in terms of synchronization. So what I would need to do is create a data source record that goes along with it. And let's see, we're going to do LDAP. So I'm going to identify the target of this is going to be this users inactive OU that I created. Let me see if I can just get rid of these others right now because it keeps confusing me every time I open this. And there we go. So we've got just the two OUs that I've created with you during this webinar. So there's users inactive. And so now that I've created the data source, I can go into the data source and I can attach the transform map to it. Now, so here's what's cool. So I don't have anything in the user record that identifies it as being inactive. So what I'm going to do, the only way that I know from this LDAP server, the only way that I know that this user is deactivated is by nature of them being in that OU. So in this case, when I set up the import and transform, hold on one second. Let me go back to the data source. I want to actually load some records here. I apologize. I'm trying to keep up with some naming conventions here, and they're not coming to me off the top of my head. So I think what we probably want is to go back to this data source. Users inactive, and let's make it named kind of like the other one. So let me save that. And then the only other thing that I'm wondering is, why am I not able to test load these records? Maybe, there we go. So it looks like when you're creating a new OU, rather than using the OU that they give you by default within a server record, when you're using a new one and then attaching a data source to it, you do need to go ahead and give your import set table a name. And then when you save that data source, it will pull up load all records. So I'm going to go ahead and load these. We should see just Bob Smith in there. And let's go to loaded data. Yep, there's Bob Smith. Now again, we know that because he's in this OU, he's going to be deactivated. So now I'm ready to go back to my data source. Here it is. It's easier to find now. It's up at the top. Actually, I'm going to do one more thing. I am so confused about these IP addresses. I'm going to just get rid of those other ones. Okay, so I'm going to go back into users, and now that I've got my import set table ready, it's going to identify that as the default source table, and then I'm going to point this to the user table. And then here's how we're going to set this map up. I'm going to save that, and then I'm just going to do two fields. I'm going to set up one field, which is going to map the UID to the user's, what is it, username, I think. User ID, there we go. And I'm going to coalesce on this field, of course, because it's the unique identifier for our user records. And then the only other thing I need to do, anyone who's found in this OU, anyone who's found during this, this load and transform, they're all going to have the same value for the target field, active. And in this case, to give it a fixed value, what I'm going to do is just say answer equals false. So using that little script, I'm able to give basically a constant value to anybody who gets transformed through this transform. So if I run this transform, it says transform is complete. Let me go to the users table again and see if I can confirm that Bob Smith here. Yeah, it looks like he was pulled off the list, so that's a good sign. Let's type in over on the left hand. I think there's a filter on this one that's showing me only active users. So I'm going to type in sysuser.list, come into Bob Smith here, and we can see that his active check mark is unchecked. So the whole takeaway from here is that you'll need to set up a separate source and a load and transform if you're going to capture those additional users. All right, so I have one last thing to make. There's no demonstration component of it. I think I can describe it through these slides, and then I'll try to quickly review a question and see if we can get to that. So I wanted to call something out. As far as managing accounts in multiple instances, a lot of people will have a dev, a test, and a production instance. And the important takeaway from that is that if you have LDAP running in all of the if you have LDAP running in all of your instances, you're eventually going to run into some inconsistencies that may break new functionality that you're trying to deploy from one instance to another using update sets. So a lot of clients, this is kind of like a sleeper issue because a lot of clients don't run into it right off the bat. And the reason why is because if we look at this scenario that I've got on the screen right now, this scenario actually works. And I kind of put there, it works luckily. So you're kind of in luck. And so just to step through this real quickly, you start over here on the left with developing in dev, right? And you activate LDAP in your dev environment because you're trying to get everything working. And so maybe then after you get LDAP working, you continue to do some development in dev. Now you create a workflow in that environment, and part of that workflow is that it sends an approval to Bob Smith. Okay, so like this is an example of where you create a workflow specifically sending an approval to somebody that you pull up from the user list, and you say send this approval to Bob Smith. There's other places where this might happen, like you might be configuring an outbound email notification. And you might be notifying somebody specific, maybe somebody who's over your infrastructure issue team or something like that. So it's the same kind of idea. You're creating new functionality where you're singling out individuals as part of the configuration. And then the last step here is this third line is that you clone from dev to production. So in this situation, the user record for Bob basically is recreated. It's cloned, and it's totally identical in the production instance. So in that situation, you're in luck because the workflow that's dependent on that user record and is in fact identifying that user record using an internal sysid, it's going to continue to work because that underlying sysid hasn't changed when you clone to prod. But here's where you run into trouble. the scenario where things are going to break, let's say you're already live in prod and you're using LDAP in dev and prod. And then what happens is Sally Johnson is hired and she's put in LDAP, and her user record is now going to be created separately in dev and prod, and they're going to have different sysids. So you've got LDAP turned on in both instances, and now she's getting created in both instances using these different sysids. You go in dev to create a workflow, and that workflow is going to point to Sally Johnson using the dev sysid, and then you deploy the workflow to your prod instance, and now it's totally broken because the sysid has changed. Sally was created directly in the prod instance through the LDAP integration, so there was no aligning or matching of the actual user records. So let me go back one slide, because at the top there's a recommendation that I want to make sure you get. And the recommendation, and actually ServiceNow reiterates this in the wiki, is that you should not, once you go live, you should not have LDAP activated in both your production and your development and test instances. So basically, when you go live, you basically use the users that you have in the dev instance as the basis for your development. And then and then that's so that you can rely on that clone functionality, so that you know from that point forward, any user records that you do have in dev, they're going to have the same sysid as production. So then the question becomes, well, what happens if we do hire Sally and we do need to put her on a workflow? In that case, what you do need to do, even though it's kind of a long process, you can, of course, you can clone production back to dev. That's one option, and in fact, that's one of the reasons why it's recommended that you clone your production instances very frequently to test, less frequently to dev. One of the reasons is so that they actually pick up all these users. But what you have to do, if that's not an option, then what you need to do is you need to actually export that user from the production instance using XML export, and then you can import that user into the dev instance using XML import, and then that way they'll have identical sysids. So I thought I'd end with, and I do apologize for the limited amount of time that we have. So one question that I have that's posted, I don't know how complicated this is. I have not had a chance to read it yet. It says, we have over a dozen different LDAP domains we need to authenticate users with. I need to be able to extract from each to a table with a command, and what's provided is basically an LDAP query. We only saw a very simple LDAP query in our little run-through. I cannot load directly into our user file. These domains have much irrelevant information, and some of the extracted LDAP users are going to be replacements for user records already in ServiceNow. So every day, I want each domain to append to a staging table with newly created user records, which we will review and process but cannot put straight into ServiceNow. Well, there's a lot in this question, and I don't know if I could address the entire question end to end, but what I will point out, though, is that within LDAP integration, once you set up your LDAP server and the OU definitions within it, like I mentioned earlier, the data source record is what bridges the gap between these servers and OUs being configured, and then the more traditional data source import set table, target table, and transform map that you're given to work with on the other end. So what you could do is you could create let's say you wanted to create a data source here that we're going to call this users users review. And so let me, I'll just give it some stupid name for the import set table. And for the LDAP target, let's just for now, for purposes of demonstration, I'm going to use this inactive thing again. But let's say instead of actually processing the deactivation directly, and this is kind of similar to the question, let's say you wanted to put it into your own table. Well, when you actually go, now that we can go into review, when I go to create my transform map, it identifies the staging table here, this import set table, and that's standard. but you don't necessarily have to target the users table. It's a standard transform map. You could target any table in all of ServiceNow, including, if you wanted, you could target the a table that you create called users to review, and then that table is where you could do some customization to provide a way to review the records, and then provide some UI actions that allow you to copy those records into the user table once they have been reviewed. So the key point here is, because it's using the standard integration modules in ServiceNow, you have a lot of flexibility to point the transform to any table besides the user table. And then, of course, within the transform map, then you set up the mappings of individual fields from the staging table, which basically is a mirror of your LDAP data source, from the staging table to that target. So I hope that addresses the one question that was sent to us ahead of time. I'm very sorry, I don't have time to get to any other questions. I don't see any of them posted in my little question pop-up window anyway. I hope this was helpful and informative. I will end with my contact information again up on the screen. Feel free to send me any questions that you have about this presentation, or if you have a fairly quick LDAP question, I would be more than happy to field those questions as well. And look again for our LDAPs, look for our webinar series to continue next month. I'm not sure exactly what the topic is going to be, but I'm sure you'll receive communication. And you can also check the webinar agenda on fruitionpartners.com. Thank you very much, everybody, and I look forward to future webinars.